She said it so calmly that it took me a second to realize what had just happened. My wife, Vandachi, set her fork down, looked across the table at the man I had just shaken hands with 20 minutes earlier, and said, "Apologize to my ex-husband." Not loudly, not with the kind of fury you could prepare for. She said it the way she said everything that mattered, like it had already been decided long before the words left her mouth, and the speaking of it was just a formality. "My name is Vandachi Reeves, and I am the one telling this story." I know. You expected someone else. You expected the husband sitting beside me, the one whose jaw went tight when I spoke. But he is not the one who lived this. He is the one I chose after I survived it. And surviving it is the part worth telling. Let me take you back to before that dinner table. Before the documents and the attorney and the man named Ray, who had been eating my food for 22 minutes while carrying a secret that could have changed everything 3 years earlier if he had been a braver person sooner. Let me take you back to a hospital waiting room, because that is where this story actually begins. Not with a wedding, not with a betrayal, but with two women sitting beside each other in plastic chairs at 2 in the morning, not yet knowing that the thing tying their lives together was already in the building, sedated, breathing through a machine in room 414. I was 29. My mother had been brought in that night with what the paramedics called a cardiac episode, which is the phrase they use when they are not ready to use the worse phrase. I had driven 40 minutes in a coat I had thrown over pajamas, and I was sitting there holding a coffee I had bought from the vending machine and not drinking, because my hands needed something to do, and my stomach was not ready for anything warm. A woman sat down 2 chairs away from me. She was dressed properly, which meant she had gotten the call earlier and had time to prepare, or she was the kind of person who was always prepared, or she was neither of those things, and the composure was just the face she wore when she was breaking. I would learn later that it was the third one. Her name was Kiana. We did not talk for the first hour. We just existed beside each other in that specific way that strangers do in waiting rooms at 2 in the morning, where the usual social distance collapses because something bigger than politeness is in the room with you. Then she said, still looking straight ahead at the wall, "Is it your mother?" I said yes. She said, "Mine is my husband." I said I was sorry. She said, "So am I." I did not know then that her husband's name was Chris. I did not know that 6 years later I would marry him. And I did not know that the woman sitting 2 chairs away from me was already holding a silence that would take 12 years to fully break. But this is the part I need you to understand before everything else. I was not naive. I was not a woman who missed signs. I was a woman who was tired, and there is a particular kind of darkness that finds you specifically when you are tired, because that is when the doors are unlocked. Chris found me when every lock I had was open. That is not an excuse for what I believed. It is just the truth of how it happened. Please, before I continue, kindly like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories. The night I met Chris, I was not looking for anything. That is the thing about the moments that change your life. They almost never arrive when you are watching the door. They come in through a window you forgot to close. Kiana had invited me to a birthday dinner for a woman we both knew loosely, the kind of friendship that exists in the space between real intimacy and polite distance. I almost did not go. I had been sleeping on a friend's couch for 6 weeks by then, having lost my apartment 2 months after losing my job, and the version of me that existed in that season was not a version I wanted to bring into a room full of people who were celebrating something. But Kiana called me that afternoon and said, "Come, you need to eat something that wasn't made in a microwave." So I went. Chris was already there when I arrived. He was standing near the far end of the table talking to someone, and the first thing I noticed about him was not his face, but his posture, the way he held himself like a man who had never once doubted that he belonged in whatever room he was standing in. I remember thinking, briefly and without consequence, that there was something almost architectural about his confidence, like it had been built deliberately, brick by brick, rather than grown. Kiana introduced us over dessert. She said his name, said mine, said something light and social about how we both knew too many of the same people. Chris smiled and handed me a card. Not his personal card, a referral. a contact at a firm that was hiring for a position that matched almost exactly the work I had been doing before the layoff. I remember looking down at the card and feeling two things at once: relief so sharp it was almost painful, and something quieter underneath it that I did not have a name for yet. A small, cautious pulling back, a flicker. I ignored the flicker. I was 6 weeks into sleeping on a couch, and my mother had been out of the hospital for 3 months but was not yet fully herself, and the card in my hand was the first concrete thing that had gone right in a season made entirely of wrong. You do not question the rope when you are already in the water. What I did not know that night was that Kiana was watching. Not me. Him. She was watching the way Chris handed me the card, the angle of his attention, the specific warmth he deployed when someone in the room was vulnerable. She had seen it before. She had been on the receiving end of it, and sitting at that birthday table, watching her ex-husband hand her grieving, unemployed best friend a referral like a fisherman laying bait, she felt something move through her that she would describe to me years later as the worst kind of knowing, the kind where you know, and you say nothing, because you are not yet certain enough to destroy someone's hope and certain enough to feel guilty about your silence for the rest of your life. She said nothing. I took the job. 3 months later, Chris and I were together, and the flicker I had felt that first night did not disappear. It just learned to be quiet. The relationship moved the way rivers move, with a current that felt natural until you realized you had no idea how far from the bank you had drifted. Chris paid off a medical bill I had been ignoring for 8 months. He did it without announcement, slipping the receipt across the kitchen counter like it was nothing. I remember standing there holding it, that flicker returning, louder this time. I said he did not have to do that. He said, "I know, that's why I did it." It was the perfect answer. It was so perfect that I should have written it down and studied it the way you study something that does not occur naturally. Nobody speaks that perfectly without practice. But I was tired, and he was warm, and warmth in the right season can make a person stop asking questions they should be asking. What I did not know was that Kiana had received the same gesture 7 years earlier. A different bill. The same receipt sliding across the same kind of counter. The same perfect answer. She had told me once, casually, that Chris was generous when they were together. I had smiled and said he still was. She had not smiled back. We married on a Saturday in October. The venue had tall windows and wooden floors and light that came in sideways in the late afternoon and made everything look like a photograph taken by someone who loved you. I wore a dress I had found 3 months earlier in a second-hand shop, altered twice, and I felt, standing at the end of that aisle, like a woman who had come back to herself after a long time away. Chris cried when he saw me. Real tears, not performed ones, or at least tears I could not tell were performed, which I now understand is not the same thing. Kiana was there. She stood in the 3rd row in a green dress, and she watched the entire ceremony with the expression of someone reading a letter they already know ends badly. I saw her face from the altar, and I thought she was simply moved. I thought it was the beauty of the moment catching her. I did not yet understand that what I was seeing on her face was not tenderness. It was grief. She was watching me walk toward something she had already walked away from, and she was not yet brave enough to stop me. The miscarriage happened on a Tuesday. I was 11 weeks along, and then I wasn't, and the world did not pause for any of it. Chris held me that night with a gentleness that felt real. I want to be honest about that. There were real moments. The cruelty of a man like Chris is not that everything is false. It is that enough is real to keep you from trusting your own perception. Kiana came over the following morning with food I did not eat and sat with me on the bathroom floor for 2 hours without saying much of anything, which was exactly right. At some point, she held my hand and said, "You are going to be okay." I believed her because she was the one person in my life who had never once told me something simply because it was easier than the truth. What I did not know, sitting on that bathroom floor, was that she had found out about the fraudulent divorce filing 4 weeks earlier. She was holding that information while holding my hand. I cannot imagine the weight of that. I have tried. I cannot. 8 months before the dinner, I found the folder. I was not looking for anything incriminating. Chris had asked me to print a lease agreement, and I was moving through his laptop quickly, the way you move through someone's things when you trust them completely and are therefore not paying the kind of attention that would save you. The folder was labeled with our wedding anniversary date. I remember pausing at that, thinking it was something sentimental, something he had saved for a reason that would make me feel loved. I opened it. Inside were scanned documents I did not fully understand. Legal filings, Kiana's name beside his, a form that looked like a divorce filing but had no processing stamp, no date of completion, nothing that indicated it had ever been submitted. I closed the laptop. I sat with it for 3 hours before I said anything. When I did, Chris poured tea. He held my hand. He explained it so calmly, with such specific detail about Kiana's vindictiveness and the delays she had caused, that by the time the tea was finished, I had rearranged what I had seen in my own mind to fit the story he was telling. That is the thing I am still working on forgiving myself for. 6 weeks before the dinner, I borrowed Kiana's coat. It was cold. I was leaving quickly. She offered it without thinking. In the inside pocket, my fingers closed around a business card. I did not look at it until I was in my car. The name on it was a paralegal. On the back, in Kiana's handwriting, were 2 words and a date. The 2 words were his name. The date was 3 weeks earlier. I sat in the car for a long time, then I called the number. The paralegal answered on the second ring, and when I told her my name, she went quiet, in a way that told me she already knew who I was. I said, "Tell me what you know." She said, "How much do you want?" I said, "Everything." She told me about the county filing. She told me about the stalled processing. She told me about a cousin named Ray who had been paid $4,000 to hold a document in a drawer for 14 months while I believed I was a legally married woman building a life. I drove home. I did not tell Chris what I knew. I began to prepare. Finding Ray took 11 days. The paralegal had his full name from the disclosure documents she had been quietly assembling. I found his address through public records, and I drove to his neighborhood on a Wednesday afternoon and sat outside the building for 40 minutes before I went in. He opened the door and knew immediately who I was, not because he recognized my face, because of the expression I was wearing. He tried to close the door. I put my hand flat against it, not forcefully, just firmly, and I said, "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm not recording this. I just need you to know what I already know, and then I need you to decide what kind of person you want to be." He let me in. We sat at his kitchen table for an hour. At some point, his daughter came in from school and walked through the room, 9 years old, backpack still on, and Ray watched her cross the hallway to her bedroom with the expression of a man being shown a mirror he had been avoiding. When she was gone, he looked back at me and said, "What do you need me to do?" I told him. He said yes. I told Kiana everything 2 weeks later. I called her and said, "Come over," and when she walked through the door, I had the business card on the table between us. She saw it and sat down slowly like someone whose knees had made a decision before the rest of them caught up. I said, "How long?" She said, 4 months. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She said, "You had just lost the baby." The room held that for a moment. I understood it. I did not agree with it, but I understood it, and understanding something is sometimes the only grace you can offer a person you love. I told her about Ray. I told her about the dinner I was planning. I told her exactly what I needed her to bring and exactly when to arrive. She listened to everything without interrupting, which was unusual for Kiana, who always had something to add. When I finished, she said, "You planned all of this while living with him." I said yes. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I should have told you sooner." I said, "Yes, but we're here now." The night of the dinner, I was calm in the way that you are calm when something has already been decided and the only thing left is the mechanics of it. I set the table with the everyday dishes. I cooked the kind of meal that says nothing unusual is happening here. Chris came home, changed his shirt, poured himself a drink, and moved through the apartment with the ease of a man who had no idea that every object in the room had been arranged with intention. When Ray arrived, Chris shook his hand and smiled and made small talk about the traffic, and I watched the two of them together and felt something I had not expected, not anger, but a strange, still clarity, like standing at the edge of something high and realizing you are not afraid of the fall. Then Vandachi said it. I said it. The words I had rehearsed so many times they had stopped feeling like language and started feeling like release. Apologize to my ex-husband. Chris's smile left his face the way light leaves a room when someone cuts the power. Not gradually, all at once. Chris left without a speech. That was the part that surprised me most. I had prepared for performance, for the charm deployed in desperation, for the version of events rewritten in real time, for the tears that had always arrived on cue in every difficult conversation we had ever had. But he picked up his keys from the counter and he walked to the door, and the only thing he said was my name, once, the way you say a word you are finished using. The door closed. The attorney gathered her folder. Ray put on his coat and paused in the hallway and said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." Kiana stood beside me in the kitchen doorway, and neither of us spoke for a while. The apartment felt different already, the way rooms feel different when the thing that was wrong about them has finally been removed and you can breathe at a different depth than you have been breathing. I washed the dishes. Kiana dried them. The attorney's car pulled out of the parking lot below the window. Outside, the city continued exactly as it always had. Kiana slept in the guest room. I sat in the kitchen before sunrise with coffee going cold in my hands, not thinking about Chris, not thinking about the legal process ahead, or the money or the documents or any of the machinery that would grind forward now without me having to push it. I was thinking about a waiting room, plastic chairs, 2 in the morning, a woman 2 seats away who said, "So am I," when I said I was sorry, and how that small moment of shared grief had built something between us that even 12 years of complications had not been able to fully break. When Kiana appeared in the doorway, she sat across from me without being asked, and we stayed like that in the early quiet. Then she said, "What do you need?" I thought about it the way you think about something you have not let yourself want in a long time. I said, "I need the next 3 years to look nothing like the last 3. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. Somewhere a dog was barking. The ordinary world indifferent and continuous, carrying us forward into whatever came next.